Welcome everybody to today's BC Support Unit webinar, which will be about an hour in length. I would like to begin the webinar by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Lake Lake Tenay, where we are in Prince George. You may have noticed that we've muted you as you join the webinar to avoid background noise during the presentation. We encourage you to use the chat box to share questions for a discussion at the end of the presentation. The chat box can be found in the top right area of your screen. At the end of the presentation, your microphone will be unmuted, so you can ask questions using your microphone or via the chat, whichever you prefer. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available on our website, bcsupportunit.ca, under Resources, so you can share it with your friends and your colleagues. After the webinar, you can expect to receive an online link sent to the email address you used to log in to this WebEx. We appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete it, as your feedback helps us plan and revise our webinar series. We'll also include the recording link in that email for you to share with others. So we would like to welcome the presentation, Learning from a UK Experience, an example of patient-oriented research which came from working with and listening to children and families. And our presenter is Dr. Caroline Sanders, Associate Professor at UNDC, and Vicky Harris, patient partner. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm sorry that I have a very quiet and husky voice today, which will now last with me forever. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for letting us be part of this seminar series for the BC Support Unit, the provincial arm of the National Strategy for the Patient-Orientated Research, which is SPORT.
We have to thank everyone who participated, as well as everyone who was part of the team at the time, and also thank you to those who have stayed linked to us over the time. As we weave our way through this presentation, we will share our candid reflections and thoughts about what went well and what could have been considered differently. We have labelled these as lessons learned.
Thank you, Vicky. So if I introduce myself on this slide, my background is as a children's nurse from the UK. I've worked in the National Health Service for more than 30 years, and I came to Canada a few years ago. I started doing research in clinical practice back in 1999, trying to look at how we could examine some of the surgical care we were completing on the children's ward at the time. I've got two children who live in various parts in the world, and for me, the value in practice to theory research is very important. I will let Vicky introduce herself.
Hello everyone, I'm Vicky. I'm a mother of three, ranging in ages now 32 to 15. And it's really my experience with my eldest child, Kelly, who's 32, that really brought me into the wonderful arms of Caroline too many years ago, I have to say. I work for a disability charity, and I support families who are just like mine, trying to cope with the challenges that we face every day. And I'm really passionate that parents and families get the support they need as and when needed.
Thank you. Next slide. So really, we wanted to think about what SPOR has meant to us when we undertook this work. So really what we wanted to do was build a research family. And like all families, it will have its challenges over time, and we recognise that. And people will come with different degrees of connection, and also we will shift as a research family over time. So really what we wanted to talk about was how the parents became involved in research, and how much of the research that Vicky and I have been involved in is very much from the ground up, looking at what were the issues that needed to change. So for us, the research has always been about being an active and participatory process. It's not something that happens without partnership. In fact, it couldn't have happened without partnership. The lessons that we've learned along the way is that to have a champion is crucial, since we realise that changes happen later, and when people move and jobs shift, then there is a different direction of travel for people. Even if we think about professionals when they move their clinical base from hospital to hospital, for example. But for those people who are researchers, it's linked to the need to search out future grants, and also what that means. And as the measurement of success organisationally is often linked to outputs and to productivity, it's often very different for families. and there is a shift about how families may wish to become involved, particularly when their child reaches the stage of independence or leaves the paediatric service, for example. Then that role as a parent shifts, as well as their engagement perhaps in research, and we need to be mindful about those family dynamics as we start to build research teams. We also need to be mindful about how young people's engagement in research itself changes over time. When parents' consent is no longer needed, the children may not wish to engage in studies in the same way that their parents had perhaps hoped that they would stay engaged as a family. So we have to think about what this really means for sport and the group's wishes when we start to engage in any research team, and how that may shift over time, and how people can be self-selecting, and how we sustain enthusiasm and commitment and input. All of those are really crucial when there is a competing issue of life out there, and what this can often mean, and how it can be very tiring for all those involved, but I would say particularly for families. So what did we do? Well, this is just one example of what we did. We've done lots of things, but we chose this one for various reasons. What we wanted to think about, and we'll give you an example so we can talk about how some of those broader issues I've mentioned actually fitted in, was we wanted to think about bowel management. A lot of people really don't like to talk about bowel management, but we know it's a pretty important fact of life. And getting it right is important for the children that we were working with, as we recognise that fecal incontinence and constipation can impact on general health, as well as lead to social exclusion and also other challenges in daily life. So being able to manage and time bowel motions or movements is an essential activity that many of us take for granted. But that's not necessarily true when we think about children who have neurogenic or neuropathic bowels. Therefore, establishing a bowel routine can be really helpful. Transrectal or transanal irrigation, there's lots of different words. It's been used for some time, and there was varying approaches. There was different fluid types, there's been make-do kits, there's been different catheters and products over the last 30 years since I came to this area of care. And often it's undertaken with lots of tubes and lubricants. You need space, you need to be able to position, and you also need levels of dexterity to look for your independence. You need to be coordinated, have some level of balance, so that you can then position yourself on the toilet to manage your bowels after you've used any treatment, if you're not able to perform the action on the toilet at the same time. And so that often involves the need for support, and also it often means the need for someone to be with you, so it challenges your privacy as well as all those other key aspects. So one of the things we wanted to do was we were very aware of the fact that there were new products starting to come to the market. And besides the fact that we knew that many conversations around bowel management were limited, we also wanted to think about what we were doing in the UK and how different we were from our European partners, for example, where irrigation is a very common conversation. You know, we could laugh about how stiff upper lips the British can be in relation to talking about bodily functions. So what we did first of all was the fact that we had to go away and review the literature, and because that's an integral part of any project, and also early publication was important to be able to have a look at what we were doing and how we could move forward. So what we wanted to think about was we wanted to bring together the issues that we knew were changing in practice, what was available on the current market. I understand that there is a difference between how we can collect products and access resources in Canada and the UK, but essentially we still have to work towards those things. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to think about finding those who were interested, energised and committed to a project. What we had to do was we had to think about how we started to build and bring a team together. We knew from clinical practice that whilst there was anyone could be interested in managing bowels or constipation, so when we mean that, we mean from your primary care physician to your specialist centre, to your parents, to providing and finding information through voluntary organisations or non-for-profit organisations, to be able to signpost families then to important products or designs or ideas that they could actually use in practice. But actually what we realised is that whilst new products were coming along, these could be prescribed, but people were reluctant to prescribe them. And this was really as a result of the fact that there was no recommended teaching or support tools available for professionals when they were making decisions about how to use rectal irrigation. And we recognised that that landscape was changing with a change to marketing. We have to be mindful in health that what products are available for children can vary. We also have some really interesting historical issues to overcome, and I think people need to be mindful of these. So we'll give you an example, is that often, voluntary organisations can act as advocates for patients and families. And what happens is, for example, somebody may go with a family to a clinical experience or an outpatient consultation. And then what happens is the fact that there may be a challenge or a difficulty communicating, or there may be some loss of trust, or the connection is broken between any of those people involved in care. And this really creates an imbalance, and that needs to be thoughtfully examined in ways that we need to be respectful and kind to all parties, because we recognise that conflict will cause challenge, and here we are talking about that in relation to children and young people. So really you have to be mindful about what histories people are bringing with them when you engage in any clinical orientated or patient orientated research, and also where those other partners may have been, and how you're going to want to rebuild those relationships when they may have broken down. And another example from our experiences related to rectal irrigation is, when families have presented themselves in clinic and they are the drivers of change and requesting inputs for their children, but acting as advocates for them. So we had many families who would present, for example, in general surgical clinic, who wanted to be able to use irrigation. But if the receiver, let's say here it's, a surgical team, don't feel that that is a way to go forward, then actually their opportunity to be able to then use these products and have different ways to manage can be constrained, which is a real problem then if you're wanting to bring this whole group together in a research way. So what we did is, in our clinical issues, when we start to get to know what this is like, we really wanted to think about taking the practice to theory, as we've been pretty much informed from theory to practice. So a key aspect is starting to build these relationships and then actually listening. And it takes time. It's not something you can do in 5 minutes. You have to get to know the population, and you have to start to then spend time actually listening. So, Vicky, do you want to talk to the parents' perspective of listening in the first instance? Oh, I can't hear you, Vicky.
Vicky's muted. There we go.
I can hear you now, I think. No?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, for a parent's perspective, I really wanted what was best for my child. I wanted to have the right support in place. I wanted to be heard. And I think with this study, I was very keen that the parents felt that they had a voice. Our goal as parents is to get our child clean, to be continent. That's really, really important. To create independence for our children, I think is key, as and when that is attainable, not for all, I'm afraid, depending on disability and impact. But for me as a parent as well, and the parents that I spoke to, I found this so very, very interesting speaking to these parents, because they were living the life that I'm living. So at times I think we don't always recognise that some of these parents actually are quite expert in their child, which is kind of what I came to be. You know, we need to be offering our families choice, training, and really importantly, support. It's key support. You know, empowering them to support their child to get a much better outcome. So that's kind of, for me, that's sort of what came across in the study, but also for me as a parent myself.
Thank you. And so really the lesson that was learned for us is the fact that actually Vicky and I got to know each other for over a longer period of time. So that built up a level of trust, and time is really valuable, and it's often very limited when people have very busy lives. And this social shift in the fact that we have less and less time in life is actually quite endemic, and it's perhaps resulted in a need to hurry things along, which can be actually counterintuitive. So within a SPORE approach, there must also be time to build and nurture and connect. It's not time wasted, and it is resource intensive. And we need to also be mindful about the longevity as well. So as Vicky talks to the fact that, you know, being listened to, having choices, training and support, you know, in any of these processes, you know, that is in a clinical skill, but in the research world as well, that's equally as important, because we're asking people to come and take new journeys with us that perhaps they haven't done before. And also we need to think about it through the lens of sustainability, so that we're mindful about what happens when people learn these skills and then want to continue with them, but also when we start to think about how we have spent time and invested, that we want that actually to continue when we've left and when people have moved on and projects are finished. So we also need to be just very mindful as we think about listening, is to really use that time to think about how quickly those patients, as we have as partners, will think about how long it takes to turn around a research project and put it into play. We did this and started in 2010. We've only just, in the last few weeks, heard feedback from the research that we did that was published in 2012 and presented in different ways that we'll talk about, that we have the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE in the UK, have used this study to be able to support children with chronic constipation access rectal irrigation. So it's still ongoing 7 years later, so it takes a very long time to bring about change, but it can be really useful in making sure that that is sustained for all children who follow behind. So really here what we wanted to do was just think about our team. So Vicky, do you want to introduce the team?
Okay, yeah. We had a lovely team, I have to say. Caroline, who, as I stated earlier, we've known each other for such a long time, which is wonderful. But as you can see, our team really consisted of a clinical researcher, 2 paediatric surgeons, a senior clinic research fellow, a nurse advisor from the commercial company, acute stoma care nurse, 2 parent co-researchers, and we mustn't forget those, voluntary organisation, the Foundation of Nurse Representative, community continence care nurse, and support for research manager in acute RD department. This team was a lovely team, I have to say. We all come in, I think we liaised and got on extremely well. So for me, I was really happy to be around like-minded people. Right.
Thank you. The interesting thing as we think about this team is the fact that they were geographically spread across the country, and also we had people who were new to research. So our acute stoma care nurse and our community continence nurse have never done research before. And our parent co-researchers, one has not done any research before at all, and one has had some experience in different ways with different forums, such as NICE, and acting in an advisory role. So it was very different sets of groups. And also funders. So the next slide really thinks about the fact that actually without funding we can't do anything. And that lends us really much to think about from a SPORE perspective is if we're asking people to invest their time in helping us develop grants as we move forward with CIHR and how this avenue has developed and grown, we have asked for patients' time and families' time to be involved in developing research bids. That's time, that's real time taken away from families' lives. Okay, so the reason that I labour that point a little bit is, are we setting people up to fail? And I throw that out there as a question. If only 5 to 8, maybe 10% of grants get funding, that's a lot of investment. 90% of people's time when they have invested is highly likely to amount to not a successful grant. Very bad English on my part, but I do apologise. So actually what happens is when we're actually involving people, are we telling them that we're signing up for things that may be unsuccessful? And how thoughtful have we been in making sure that we're transparent about that process? Because, you know, to be rejected, you know, ongoing has an impact on researchers, but on families too, it can be seen very negatively. Perhaps Vicky can speak to that later. So here we actually brought this team together once we had the funding, but we had been very clear about the fact that we knew enough people to be involved, and they were gracious to consider that fact. We also were different in the fact that we thought, actually, when we need to think about getting our KT message out, we thought about that really early, is the fact that how do we reach all these families? And one of the ways that we do that is you have to be mindful about who's going to be your loudest voice, and for us it was commercial partners. So we actually thought about a marketing strategy that actually used a company, and here it was Coloplast. And there are other companies now, but at the time that there was not. So we need to be cognizant of actually how do you really get a wide message out so that what you produce is free, so that people can then access this in their, you know, to be able to develop their own capacity to be able to manage. So our study design was very much as everybody would expect. There was a research question which we actually agreed, and as Vicky talks very eloquently about our team, there was a little bit of discussion unusually about our research question. We had to agree a methodology, so we thought about action research for various reasons. And also we had to discuss what everybody's roles and responsibilities would be, and how we would be held accountable to those is very important too, because, you know, people do come, people do go. We had people change their job roles during our study. So there needs to be that real line of transparency on what that means. Because if people's, you know, events happen in people's lives, there has to be some wiggle room. One of the key things to really think of too is preparation and training, because without it, there is no success. It is more than searching the literature. We can do that at any time and in lots of different ways. There is a need to have some research management support, particularly for us at the time within an acute organisation, because there is policy, there is issues of safety. We need to be able to think about liability, organisational responsibility. There were many things that we had to think of as soon as we had a group that involved patients as partners in undertaking research that really led us to critically think about how we kept everybody safe, how we were responsible, how we managed payments, and how we actually used all that information in a constructive way. And so, yes, we had to develop lots of policies. So we did need good support from our R&D team to be able to do that. And also we had to think about how we would reflect on this process and who would do that and how we would do that individually and how we would come and do that as a group. So the mixed methods that we used were survey orientated, and we can explain those. I'm sure they're nothing new to many in the audience, but actually that research cycle is just on that action research and how we go through the loop and how we looked and how the different groups, because the group on its own would have been too big, we kind of had two separate groups. And that kind of worked quite well. So there was an overarching group that came together at various occasions, but there was also a core working group that did much of the research and then shared it with the wider group as a consultancy group, if you like. So actually there was just here to kind of give you some insight into process, and I'm sure that this isn't new to very many of you, but the ethics process was interesting as always in relation to how do you pay a patient partner. You know, we were lucky in the fact that we have the evolved strategy to be able to look to, but it also meant then actually how do you be thoughtful about benefits that people may be receiving, what kind of acts as a gift, does that make people feel less included when they're not salaried? All of these things need to be considered. We needed to think about the financial payment process, and we also, because we're working with children and families, you need to make sure here it's the UK's Criminal Records Bureau checks to make sure that people are safe. So who did that and who paid for that? Because nothing in life comes free. There's always a cost. And did we need honorary contracts, which we did, to build in, and again, our R&D manager was so helpful. What we also smiled about was the fact that Vicky, in her parent researcher role, actually undertook the interviews, and she'll talk some more about that shortly with the other parents. But that then set Vicky up into a position, once she'd agreed to do this as part of our team conversation, was very much about, well, how do you do that? What would that look like? Is there a good pathway for us to follow to be able to do this well with confidence? How do you use the equipment? What kind of issues do we have in relation to child protection training for anybody who is undertaking that kind of work, who is on an honorary contract outside of the organisation for which you're employed for? How do we then, what do we do with the data that we've collected, and how do we do some training around analysis? So all of these things need to be really thoughtfully considered, and we were really surprised, for example, that when we went looking for a telephone interview protocol for parents to use as the researcher, we couldn't find them. So we trawled the literature to find something that would be really useful and had application to actual clinical practice and utility, and there was very little for us to find. So we have made one, so if anybody wants one, we really have a very tight telephone interview protocol now to make sure that there is some support. You also had to think about all the other ways that we had to communicate as we were a diverse group geographically. So we had to think about how we set up boxes to be able to have group emails, how we planned our face-to-face meetings. We're nowhere near as good as the information technology that you have in Canada, and I've learned things now that we would apply if I did it at home again, but we need to be mindful of those. And also we had to unpick some of the very interesting things that we ended up as we worked through the process, is the fact that, you know, so many words that we take for granted are laden with so many other meanings. So, for example, this in the end was called a toolkit because we couldn't call it a pathway, because there was a whole process behind calling anything a pathway that we were never actually going to be able to achieve, but it was an interesting learning experience. We also had to think about supervision and who was going to actually undertake that and in what role and capacity, and did anybody else need any support to be able to do that for our parent co-researchers. And also the Foundation of Nursing Studies wanted to come and make sure that their money was being well spent, which is absolutely fine, so we needed to include those individuals in our meetings as well, which was great for the actual funders to be part of the process to see how it all panned out when it came to real life undertaking this study. So really quickly reporting on the study, because I wasn't quite sure whether that was what people would be interested. We had to design a questionnaire, we had to then send it out, how long a period of time it was open for, and how then we used the survey to professionals to kind of map out the landscape, as I said earlier, to say who was doing what in relation to rectal irrigation, and also to provide space so that we could actually get some open-ended comments back from individuals. Telephone studies, I think, is probably one of the most important pieces to speak to, because I didn't do it, so we supported Vicky to be able to do this, and I think she has some really interesting insights in what it's like when you take this forward in a meaningful way. So, Vicky, I'll leave that with you.
Thank you. Initially, I was quite anxious about the telephone interview, just in case I said something I shouldn't have said, but I got a lot of support prior to, I had to practice, but I was, after that, quite raring to go. Regarding the telephone interviews, what we had to do in advance really was arrange the research space to ensure the ease of accessibility to research tools and relevant notes, as well as privacy during the interview. For me, I wanted, as a parent myself, and being really mindful that I'm coming in as a parent, not as a professional here, that I wanted the parent to feel that it was just them and I, that were having the conversation. That was really important. But also that I could encourage them to speak openly and honestly, because that's what we were really looking for was honest feedback. And being a parent, I felt that they would understand that it was okay to speak to me on a level of understanding. So we conducted, where possible, the interviews where the participant can access a landline for cost, privacy and safety reasons. And this is available in the Nursing Research Unit. Ensure that it's a convenient time for both the interviewer and the participant before initiating the interview. There was nothing worse than trying to ring a parent who maybe not expected your call, so everything was planned in advance, which I think was really good. Knowing that the parents that we were interviewing were parents, you know, there was a lot of expectation of them. So the dates and the times of the interviews were to be arranged in advance by either me or a member of the research team. We weren't able to start the interview without being sure that all equipment was working, everything we needed, to make sure that we were able to record, because I don't think the parent would be very happy if we had to go back and redo it. So that was really, really important, that everything worked. And also the parent that was involved in the interview did not feel too pressurised to give quick responses. That was really important as well. Sort of almost really answering before they'd really thought about what I was asking them, because that you know, at the end of the day, I wanted open and honesty from the parents, so I wasn't to push or to force a response. Also, really importantly, was to make sure that I was speaking to the correct person when we picked up the phone. Little Johnny wasn't going, hello, hello, obviously asking to speak to Johnny's mum or Johnny's father, which is very, very important. And also recognising that human sort of humour is really important. And obviously me being from Liverpool, we are well known to be quite funny, I have to say. So really not making the interview too serious, because these families already live that life. So having a bit of fun as well. That's key, I think, to everything in life. Thanking the participant for their time and letting them know that if they would like a copy of the, you know, the transcript, then they were more than entitled to see that. That was, because I think as a parent, it's always nice to know that being involved in something, you're making a difference. That's really important, I think. So when asking, I think for me really, I was really well prepared for the interviews. I had a safe space afterwards to be able to talk about if it brought up anything that maybe might have been a little bit uncomfortable for me, hence the life that I'd lived, having had a child, having had bowel surgery. For me, it was really important to engage with these parents on the level, which I think that I did. I have to say that I really, really enjoyed it. I felt really proud of myself. And I think that we got really open and honest answers, which is what we were looking for. So we allowed the parents a safe space to be able to talk about everything without me, I hope, not interfering too much and wanting to do them along.
Thank you. So from our data collection, we had 24 professionals from a broad range of paediatric disciplines that completed the online questionnaire. There were consultant surgeons, urology nurses, stoma nurses, continence nurses, outreach nurses, community nurses, and a voluntary organisations as well. And 20 of the professionals were currently involved in teaching patients and families and children how to use irrigation, but the majority had received training, but they classed it as some unlimited training. Most of the nurses actually felt that they were delivering care reasonably well, and they felt that they were confident in undertaking irrigation. However, they did consistently report that an absence of guidelines and competencies, local, national or international, was considered as unhelpful by up to 70% of those who were surveyed. So the most common approach for information sharing with the parents was reported as verbal, at which point that was up to like 90%, which we know from studies is, you know, a very difficult thing for everybody to remember if we're just giving auditory education. The written information produced by commercial companies at the time was cited as helpful but incomplete. And sadly, only one professional that we found would direct parents to support sites. And we had about 35% of the professionals actually connected families together to be able to learn in supportive groups through Facebook groups that we knew that other families had, for example. So we introduced them so that they could find their own support networks and mechanisms. So even though we talk about all of these things, often sometimes we were finding that they were not happening in real life, even though we were paying lip service to them. So from the parent data, we managed to recruit 18 parents, which at the time was probably about, well, it was around 60 or 70% of the population that were actually using this particular product. Don't forget, it was still pretty new. So they started using this particular product between the ages of 3 to 18. So you suddenly have a massive group of parents with children of very different ages. And the children were discussed as having predisposing medical conditions that really varied from things like spina bifida, imperforate anus, and sacrogenesis, to cloaca, and there was a couple that we were unsure of. So some of these children had a real mixed experience of surgery or neurological change as a result of a birth condition. A few of the parents, so 4 of them had stopped using the irrigation, whereas actually 78% of them were still using it, and this was more than a year later, which actually fits with some of our European friends and how they report on the literature. And currently they were all using this system because, as we said, it was the only one on the market at the time. And we can talk about the fact that actually how do you lobby for pediatrics, for example, to be able to get the right products that it needs, because we are a small target audience. But that's perhaps a conversation for another day. And also we came to realise that actually people were giving very different advice about what kind of fluid to use. So that was interesting in itself. What was really interesting was the fact that actually only 2 of all the children who were still using the systems could actually do this independently. So even though Vicky has alluded to the fact that actually the idea is the fact that these children in the future would become independent in managing their irrigation, we found that there was only 1 9-year-old girl and 1 14-year-old boy who were able to do this independently. And so we still have parents helping children out at various points in their lives, certainly in their early to mid-teens, with bowel management care, despite the fact that we were moving towards products that were supposed to promote independence. So we had a real dilemma in the fact that we had professional groups who were not using them, who chose not to like this kind of approach to managing. We had professional groups who had varying level of education and were unsure about what information and support families needed, and then families themselves who were still challenged by the fact that they wanted to continue the care for their children over time. I'm very conscious of time, so if I move on, I think one of the most important things that I'd really want to share is the fact that actually, and I'm going to let Vicky speak to this, is the experience as the parent researcher, because we talk about this very often, but what is it actually like, and how do we then do something with all this kind of experience, knowledge, information that Vicky has amassed through actually being part of something that helped to change practice, certainly in the UK. Vicky.
Thank you. I was really keen to be involved. As soon as Caroline asked, I said yes. Yes, please, that's me, definitely. I was a little bit anxious, I have to say, because I don't being recorded makes me a little bit anxious in case I said something wrong. But I think on a level as being a parent myself, having experienced the highs and lows, I was really keen to engage with other parents to understand that it's okay that, our children have problems. And I wasn't the only one, so I think on a selfish level it really reached me as well. I felt able to converse with these parents, and I felt that they were able to open up to me. I felt extremely well supported by the research team. They offered a lot of encouragement throughout. When I would go home and sit and think about what it is I said, or maybe I shouldn't have said that, but actually when touching base with them, I felt like I'd done a really good job, which was really important to me. But one thing I did become aware of, just there was a couple of parents that I actually spoke to who you could tell just by their voice as soon as they picked up the phone, they sounded extremely down. And I felt sort of quite concerned for them that clearly just by their voice I could tell that it hadn't worked for them, or they weren't able to continue doing the washouts or whichever they were doing. And the impact on them was really hard and challenging. And then we had another parent who, she was really happy, and you just knew it worked. I just knew by the tone of her voice it had worked, and it was so lovely to hear. So we really got a taste of sort of both ends, if you like. So yeah, that I found I wanted to be able to, I think, fix the problem, if you like, for the parents that were really struggling, but know that I couldn't. I think on a parent level. I felt very honest with being asked. I think the questions were really good. Everything was very, very well thought out and very, very thorough.
Cool, thank you. So really there was just a couple of outcomes that, were drawn together, and I think the quality of the interviews was interesting. As having been a researcher who'd done interviews before in the past, it is interesting to look back on whether those people who live the lives that we have a level of curiosity about, and we are keen to try to be supportive and work with and be helpful for, actually we don't live those lives. We are curious about them in a way to be helpful with the best intentions, but we don't live them. And actually that is something that was really interesting in the interviews, when they were different in some ways. And we did spend, as Vicky says, a lot of time going through what that was about and how that had worked and what that actually really meant. So really the themes that came out were the parents' investment in their children's bowel management, and the fact that actually for something that we take as such a very much for granted experience of bodily function in everyday life became such a focus of need for families. So they really struggled to find the right treatment for their children, and that fecal incontinence was emotionally draining for all of those people who were involved. So the journey to find a reliable, timely and effective bowel management regime which enabled their child really to be continent and sometimes independent, but not as often as we thought. Free from pain. We had not always appreciated the level of pain some of these children were experiencing. And the fact that actually parents and families needed enormous courage to keep trying new ideas and keep trying new treatments, whether they be oral, whether they be administered in various other ways. And many different factors actually influenced how parents made decisions about using irrigation. The role of coaxing their children, even if they were unhappy, to be able to use it. So the parents actually, were huge advocates for change and really were key and crucial into taking forward, how we could actually manage this. And we learned an enormous amount about the time it takes for families to be able to come to think about this and actually move forward in trying new ideas that often as clinical teams we may put out there, because it's their time and they're the ones who have to do this at home on a day-to-day basis. And also families need to be confident, and if they're not confident, then actually things are less likely to be successful. And confidence also links to education and training, hence that's a challenge if we don't have protocols, pathways, or whatever it is that gives staff levels of competency. We really did obviously discover about independence and the fact that actually we had a whole marketing team that was obviously through Coloplast here, but all the other companies are the same now, is to say, actually this will make you independent. Actually that is not just the only factor that actually leads to that. And so it's really important is to not set people up to fail. Otherwise that really is a challenge, and we need to be really mindful of that. And we needed to think about people's social future, and we were really surprised by the fact that people had a great degree of social challenge as a result of needing respite care, for example, and the fact that nobody would then support their child to go to respite care if they needed rectal irrigation, because nobody would actually take on that role if their child had disabilities that allowed them not to be independent. So we learned an enormous amount about life. What we also wanted to do was make everything free and everything available to people. So we ended up coming up with a toolkit, again, because we couldn't use that kind of language. And it is free and it's embedded in so many different places. It became available to the voluntary organisation, to their foundation nursing studies. We advise people to have it for free and stick it on their website, so it's on various hospital websites. And most importantly, what happened was the toolkit, if we think about it, was also picked up by the company themselves. So what happened was the fact that we were very clear, and if you can see on our last slide here, we worked with Coloplast to make some patient information leaflets that actually embedded the toolkit so that it's available, that goes out with all of the kit, and it's free, it's downloadable, it can get it from various places, which was really useful. Because what we didn't want to lose and what was here and what we also thought about is everything that we'd learned, and we hadn't planned to, but we made 3 vignettes in the end that were a composite of all the stories, because we'd had such rich data from the interviews to be able to say, look, these are stories that are made up from every piece of data that we have, to be able to not lose the essence of actually all the time that the families gave us. And that was something that Vicky and our other parent researcher had brought to the table to us as the research team, is to say you can't forget that, and you're actually being disrespectful if you do. So that was why we changed the toolkit, so that it had various information, but it also had some case examples. The other thing too is the outputs. So, you know, we're not always the fastest writers in the world, and then even if we write, they have to go in a journal, and it takes a year or 2 for somebody to publish them, and then they've all got to be free. So what was really interesting was the fact that actually, as you can see, Vicky is one of our co-authors. And Vicky might wish to speak to that piece, because I think she was, I mean, I've written with families before and started that back in the early 2000s, and wrote with parents when we'd done many things, because, you know, I think it's part of sharing that narrative. But Vicky can talk to you very much about the fact that then I dragged her along to conferences, yes, sometimes unwillingly, as she smiles there as we get stuck on trains going to Canterbury. But yes, so writing papers and going to conferences and presenting with Vicky and other parents that I have in the past is crucial to making sure that there is a closure for people at the end of the research study too. Vicky, do you want to add anything about what that was like for you?
Terrifying. No, I have to say that when Kaz first mentioned it, although I was quite anxious because I'd never really spoken before, I was a little bit scared, but I really believed in Kaz. She was an angel that came into my life, and but it's true, she was. I was living a very sort of difficult, challenging life until she came into my life, and my daughter was 9 years old, and I just thought that I had to give something back. You know, which was really important for me, but also have that voice. As a parent, we don't have a voice, and I really wanted to have a voice, and I didn't want other parents to experience everything that I'd been through. You know, so if I can make the future parents who have children just like my child make their journey better, that was really important for me. But yeah, we've known each other a long, long time, I have to say. So we have that trust between us. But speaking to doctors, and I was really frightened. I didn't feel like I was worthy to be there, but I really challenged the fear that I had for the greater and the good, and actually was really proud of myself at the end of it. Absolutely proud of myself, definitely.
You did awesome, because you always ended up with more questions than I did, so it was always really important.
I enjoyed it.
I'm glad you did, because now I'll keep you to that. We've not finished yet.
Oh, shouldn't have said that.
So lessons for the future really is the fact that actually, you know, we all learn as we go on our research journey, and so there's always things that we look back at and can go, oh, it would have been great to have carried this on and done this in a particular way. And so we recognise that, you know, there is always that next piece of research, but it's always linked, obviously, to that lovely piece about funding. So, you know, what we leave here as a legacy in relation to this particular piece of research is the fact that actually we learned that from our input and some of the work that we did here and the work that we'd helped to in a different way in Sheffield, in the UK was the fact that there was enough evidence for NICE to be able to actually legitimately carry on taking forward this approach for children. And so it was a very useful piece of work that actually has continued 7 or 8 years later to have a voice, which is very important. What's interesting is the fact that, you know, we also forget about research legacy and responsibility, and that's something I really just want to give us a second to be thoughtful of, is the fact that when we start something, as researchers often we may be dependent on money and things will come and go, but actually for people's lives that's not the same way. As Vicky says, you know, I've known her daughter for a very long time, and actually they live a life. So the research that we do is part of the story then that weaves its way through their lives and the way that I've connected with Vicky and her family. And we need to be really mindful of that, in the fact that actually it does build those kinds of relationships, and there are professional relationships, and we need to think about how we manage those. But the legacy is, how do things continue when people leave? So I have left the UK and come to Canada, but actually the interesting thing was it was the pharmacists at the hospital I used to work at that we connected to help us formulate how we were going to respond to NICE. So it's about making sure that you're available to stay in touch, and it doesn't matter whether that's 5, 10 or 15 years later. Actually, you have a responsibility not to disappear, and that's a real challenge. And research legacy, I'm not actually sure we spend a great deal of time thinking about, but if we want to do this meaningfully, particularly within a patient-orientated space, then you have to. So for us then, really taking some of the key things away is that it takes time. There is a shared responsibility. There needs to be clarity and there needs to be purpose. You need to celebrate your successes, and you need to be able to have a good sense of humour at your failures, because they will come and get you when you least expect them. And where you think you might have 3 or 4 things to do, stick a 0 on the end, because there's likely to be 30 or 40 things you need to do to make actually something come to life and for it to be good and safe and meaningful. So we're happy to take any questions, and hopefully this is useful in the fact that we've thought about this in just a different way to share. Vicky, is there anything you'd like to end on? Because you always get the best laugh.
I think for me that investing in our families, that's really, really important. You know, we have so many skills that we've developed over time that working hand in hand is really important to me. We look to you to offer us the support, and we hope that we can work as a team. That's really important. You know, at the end of the day, we're all working for the same outcome. We want the best for the families that we're supporting. We want the families to, you know, support their child to be the best that they can be and have the greatest journey that they can have. And for me, that's the most important thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn and Vicky. So we're just going to open it up to the lines to questions.
Sunday. I would go Saturday again. I'm sorry.
So if anybody has any questions.
I really enjoyed it.
So one question we have is, how are the parent co-researchers financially reimbursed, and was this included in your grant application?
Yes, so we reimburse people in relation to their time. So we also had that included in the grant application, and talked about the fact that we were mindful of people.
So she's not trying to log in?
I don't know. Let me see her.
So we were just very upfront about the fact that then the individuals who we gave an honorarium to, which was applicable to a salary, you know, an hourly rate of income, then had to declare that to the tax. We didn't get involved in actually doing any tax returns for the individuals. And it's a really interesting space, and I'm learning tax is very different in Canada than it is in the UK, generally anyway, but it's something to be mindful about how that could be navigated and then whose responsibility that becomes.
Thanks, Caroline. Is there any other questions?
Hi, it's Nicolette McGuire from Ministry of Health on the phone.
Hi.
Hi, I didn't have a question, but I had rather a comment, just really appreciating being able to hear from both Carolyn as well as Vicky, and hearing about not only was the research enhanced through Vicky's participation, but that there was this well-developed relationship that really enhanced the research and moved this research forward to the benefit of families, as well as to the research being done in this area. So I just thought this was a really good example of what we are hoping for in terms of making these connections between researchers and patients, and I just appreciated having this example as a template. And wanted to thank both of them for sharing.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Were there any other questions or comments? Great, thanks. So this concludes today's webinar. A huge thank you to Caroline and Vicky once again, and thank you to the participants who attended today's webinar. As mentioned earlier, you can expect to receive an online survey link that's sent to the email address that you used to log into the WebEx. We appreciate your taking a few minutes to complete it, as feedback helps us plan and revise our webinar program. We'll also include the recording link in the email for you to share with others. So our next webinar in this series is scheduled for April 4th at noon, where the Patient Engagement Methods Cluster will present a recap of its visioning workshop. So thank you once again, and have a great day.